In the vast expanse of the galaxy, humanity had encountered countless alien species, each with their own cultures and ways of life. One such species was the Feroians, a wolf-like race, known for their loyalty to their packs and their strength in battle. They lived on a lush, untamed planet, filled with dangerous predators and breathtaking landscapes. Their society was built around tight-knit groups, where each individual was bound by an unbreakable loyalty to the others. But that was before humanity's military campaign reached their planet. The invasion of the Feroian world had been swift and brutal. Ships from Earth, equipped with advanced technology, landed on the surface with no warning. The Feroians, known for their unmatched fighting abilities, had fought valiantly, defending their land and their people. But despite their efforts, they were outmatched by the sheer power and numbers of the human forces. Cities were reduced to rubble, and the once thriving Feroian civilization was brought to its knees. Laika, a young female Feroian, had been one of the last survivors of her pack. Her pack had been more than just family. They were everything to her. Each member was a piece of the whole, and their bond went deeper than blood. Laika had grown up learning the ways of the hunt, the tactics of survival, and the sacred rituals that kept the pack strong. She had been trained for years to be a warrior, to protect the pack at all costs. But all of that had been ripped away in a single, violent day. Her pack had been ambushed in the middle of the night by a group of human soldiers. The humans, with their advanced weaponry and combat strategies, had overwhelmed them. Laika had barely escaped the attack, her body bruised and battered, but her mind still sharp with the sting of loss. Her heart ached with the memories of her fallen comrades, their faces, their voices, their laughter, all gone in an instant. She wandered through, the burning remnants of her village, the smell of smoke thick in the air. The sounds of the attack still echoed in her mind, the screams, the gunfire, and the roar of the Feroian warriors as they fought to the bitter end. Laika had fought alongside them, her claws tearing through the human soldiers, her teeth sinking into their flesh. But it hadn't been enough. The human soldiers had come in overwhelming numbers, and one by one her packmates had fallen. Now, Laika was alone. The world she had known for so long was gone, reduced to ashes. There was nothing left to fight for. The forest, once her home, now felt like a foreign land. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. Her only goal now was survival. But even that felt pointless. What was survival without her pack? What was the point of continuing when everything she had loved was lost? The thought made her pause as she stood at the edge of a cliff, gazing out at the darkened horizon. The sky above was thick with clouds, the remnants of the storm that had been brewing in the distance. It was as though the universe itself mourned with her. As she stood there, lost in thought, the sound of footsteps reached her ears. It wasn't the quiet, rhythmic patter of another Feroian, but the heavy, deliberate steps of something, or someone, different. Laika's muscles tensed, her instincts kicking in. She didn't know whether it was an enemy or just another scavenger, but she was ready to fight. She lowered herself into a crouch, her fur bristling, her claws digging into the earth beneath her. A shadow appeared in the distance, moving steadily toward her. Her eyes narrowed as she watched the figure approach. It was tall, bipedal, and clearly humanoid. Laika's heart pounded in her chest, and her breath quickened. It was a human. She could tell by the way they moved, the way they carried themselves. The human didn't seem to notice her at first, too focused on the path ahead. He was dressed in a rugged uniform, the markings of a military force that Laika didn't recognize. His face was stern, his eyes scanning the area around him. His attention was fixed on the landscape, unaware of the alien creature crouching just beyond his sight. Laika's first instinct was to attack. Humans were the ones who had destroyed her world, who had killed her people. But something stopped her. As the human drew closer, she saw something in his expression, a flicker of something that didn't belong in the eyes of an invader. It wasn't anger or hatred. It was curiosity mixed with something softer, something that she couldn't quite place. The human finally looked in her direction, his eyes locked with hers, and for a brief moment, there was silence. Laika remained still, her muscles coiled, ready to strike at a moment's notice. But the human didn't move. He simply stared at her, his face unreadable. Laika's gaze faltered for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, the human spoke. His voice was calm, steady, and surprisingly gentle. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his words almost soothing in their tone. The words sent a jolt through Laika's body. She wasn't sure if she should trust him. After all, humans had brought nothing but pain and destruction to her people. But there was something in his voice, a sincerity she hadn't expected. He was different from the others. The two of them stood there in the silence, neither of them moving, neither of them sure of what to do next. The wind rustled through the trees, the only sound breaking the stillness. Laika's mind raced. She wanted to attack, to avenge her fallen pack, but the human's words had unsettled her. Was it possible? Could there be more to him than the soldiers she had fought before? Finally, Laika took a step back, her eyes still locked on the human. She wasn't ready to trust him, not yet. But she couldn't bring herself to strike either. The moment stretched on, and for the first time since the destruction of her pack, Laika felt something stir within her, a spark of hope, fragile and faint, but still there. Maybe, just maybe, this human wasn't like the others. Maybe he could be something more. Laika moved through the forest, her steps heavy with exhaustion. The pain from the battle was still fresh in her body, but it was the emotional weight that was truly unbearable. The loss of her pack felt like a wound that would never heal. She had been taught from a young age that the pack was everything. Without them, she was incomplete. Her purpose had always been to protect her family, to fight for them, to ensure that their way of life would continue. But now, with no one left to protect, she was lost. The sky above was a dull gray, thick clouds hanging low, casting a somber shadow over the forest. It was the season for storms, and Laika had no doubt that one was coming. She moved quickly through the trees, searching for shelter, any kind of refuge from the coming storm. But the forest, once familiar and comforting, now seemed alien to her. Every rustle in the trees, every sound of shifting leaves made her jump, her senses on high alert. The humans were still out there, their presence a constant reminder of the destruction they had caused. After what felt like hours of wandering, Laika finally found a small cave tucked into the side of a cliff. It was hidden from view, the entrance, barely wide enough for her to slip through. She squeezed inside, the cool stone pressing against her fur. The cave smelled damp, and the sound of water dripping echoed in the silence. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. She curled into a tight ball in the back, her body aching from the day's battles. She didn't know if she could rest. Every time. She closed her eyes. She saw the faces of her fallen packmates, their expressions frozen in the moment of their deaths. But exhaustion soon took over, and Laika's eyelids grew heavy. As she drifted off to sleep, her mind wandered to the brief encounter with the human. His words echoed in her mind. "I'm not here to hurt you." She had heard those words before, but they had never felt as strange as they did when he spoke them. She wasn't sure if she could believe him. Humans had never shown mercy to her kind, and she had been taught to distrust them above all else. But his eyes. There was something different about him. He hadn't been like the others. The thought lingered in her mind as sleep took her. When she awoke, the storm was in full force. The wind howled outside the cave, sending gusts of rain into the entrance. Laika stirred, the cold seeping into her bones. Her fur was soaked, and the weight of the rain was pressing down on her. She had hoped the storm would pass quickly, but it seemed to only grow worse. She could hear the roar of thunder in the distance, the sky flashing with bright, erratic light. In her restlessness, Laika found herself standing at the entrance of the cave, looking out into the storm. The wind whipped her fur, and the rain soaked her to the skin, but she didn't care. She felt a deep need to be outside, to feel the storm as it raged around her. It was as if the storm mirrored the chaos inside her heart, wild, untamed, and unstoppable. But then, in the midst of the fury of the storm, she heard something, a sound that cut through the howling wind. Footsteps. Laika's ears twitched, and her body went rigid. She dropped into a crouch, her senses sharpening. Was it another human, or something worse? The footsteps grew louder, and Laika tensed, ready to defend herself. She could see the outline of a figure emerging from the storm, their shape just barely visible through the sheets of rain. The figure moved toward her cave with purpose, their steps determined. Laika's heart raced. She had no intention of letting anyone find her, especially not after everything she had been through. But there was something in the way the figure moved that told her they weren't here to harm her. It wasn't the hurried, desperate steps of someone seeking shelter. It was the calm, controlled movement of someone who knew where they were going. The figure drew closer, and Laika's breath caught in her throat when she saw it was him, the human, Captain Ethan Stryker, the same human she had seen earlier in the day. His face was set with determination, his eyes focused, but when he looked up and saw her standing in the entrance of the cave, he froze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The storm howled around them, the rain drenching them both, but it felt like everything had paused. Ethan's eyes were wide with surprise, but there was no fear in them. He didn't seem surprised that she was there, standing alone in the storm. It was as if he had expected her. Laika stood still, her body tense and ready for a fight, but something in his gaze told her that he wasn't here to harm her. Slowly, she rose from her crouch, her eyes never leaving his. The wind tugged at the edges of her fur, the cold making her feel more vulnerable than she had in a long time. Ethan took a step forward, slowly, cautiously, as if trying not to startle her. "You shouldn't be out here in this storm," he said, his voice steady and calm, just like before. His words were simple, but there was a warmth to them that made Laika hesitate. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had spoken to her with such care. He glanced behind him as if to make sure nothing else was following him, then turned back to her. "I've been looking for shelter, too," he added. "I didn't think I'd find someone here." Laika's instincts screamed at her to run, to leave the human behind and find another place to hide. But something inside her, something she couldn't name, kept her there, watching him. The storm was raging, but she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm in his presence. For a long moment, they stood there, two beings from different worlds, caught in the storm of their own making. Neither of them spoke, but neither of them left. Finally, Ethan stepped back slightly as if giving her space and nodded toward the cave. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said again, his voice gentle. "Can I take shelter with you?" Laika hesitated. She was not used to sharing her space, especially not with a human. But she had nowhere else to go. The storm was unforgiving, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel completely alone. With a reluctant nod, she stepped back into the cave, allowing him to follow her. As he entered, the warmth of the cave seemed to soften the cold that had settled in her bones. They sat in silence for a long time. the only sound the howling wind and the steady drip of water. The storm continued to howl through the night, the rain relentless against the cave's entrance. Laika sat in the back of the small shelter, her eyes, still watching the human who had taken refuge with her. Captain Ethan Stryker had settled near the entrance, pulling his wet jacket tighter around him as he tried to warm up. Despite the violent storm outside, the cave had a certain calm about it, a strange peace that seemed foreign to Laika. The tension between them was palpable, but there was also an odd, unspoken understanding in the air. They were both survivors, in a world that had turned upside down. Laika could feel the weight of the loss pressing on her chest, the destruction of her pack, the slaughter of her people, and the uncertainty of what came next. She had never thought she would find herself in a situation like this, alone with a human. In her mind, humans had always been enemies, invaders, destroyers. But there was something different about Ethan. She couldn't explain it, but something told her he wasn't like the others. For a long time, neither spoke. Ethan seemed content to let the silence hang in the air. He had his back against the cave wall, his eyes closed as he listened to the sound of the storm outside. Laika, however, couldn't relax. She paced the cave, her fur still damp from the rain, her mind racing with thoughts. Her instincts told her to remain distant, to stay cautious, but there was a small part of her that wondered if she could trust him. That part of her, the one that had once believed in loyalty and companionship, was confused. Humans had taken everything from her, yet here she was, sharing her only refuge with one. She paused near the back of the cave, her body tense. "Why, are you here?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was low, but it carried the weight of 100 unasked questions. She had to know why he had come after her, why he hadn't just let her go. Ethan turned his head, his eyes meeting hers. "I told you before, I'm not here to hurt you." His voice was calm, steady, but there was something else in it. It wasn't just the words. It was the sincerity behind them. Laika wasn't sure she understood it, but she could hear it. "But why help me?" she pressed. "You humans destroyed my pack. You wiped out everything I knew. Why would you risk your life for me?" Ethan's expression softened and he leaned forward slightly. "I don't know all the answers. I've seen a lot of bad things in this war, but I've also seen things that don't make sense. I've seen people who weren't afraid to help each other, even when they didn't have to. I've seen you fight. You're not like the others, Laika." His voice was gentle, but there was a firmness to it that struck her. "I can't change what happened to your people, but I'm not going to let it control how I act." Laika was quiet for a moment. The wind outside picked up again, howling through the trees, but it felt distant, almost muffled in comparison to the thoughts swirling in her head. She had been raised to hate humans, to see them as nothing but enemies. But here was one, sitting in front of her, speaking words she didn't expect. Her mind raced, struggling to make sense of it all. She could still feel the sting of her pack's loss, the anger she had buried deep inside, but there was also a part of her that wanted to believe Ethan, to believe that not all humans were the same. She had lost so much. Was it too much to hope for something good in the midst of the destruction? She didn't know. "I don't trust you," she said, her voice low but firm. "But I can't fight you right now." She turned her back to him, walking further into the cave, trying to get away from the uncomfortable weight of his gaze. Ethan didn't respond right away. For a long time, there was only the sound of the rain and the wind, and the quiet crackle of the fire they had started for warmth. Laika found a small corner of the cave and lay down, curling her body into a tight ball. She didn't want to let her guard down, didn't want to acknowledge how vulnerable she felt. But the storm outside and the presence of the human inside the cave made everything feel too still, too heavy. Ethan, for his part, stayed silent as well. He didn't push her for answers, didn't try to speak again. He simply sat by the fire, letting the silence grow between them. As the hours passed, Laika's body grew heavier with sleep, though her mind remained restless. She kept her eyes closed, but her ears remained alert. She wasn't sure what she expected from the human, but whatever it wasn't this uneasy truce. There was a part of her that wanted to be left alone, to stay in her pain and anger. But another part of her, the part that had known the closeness of her pack, couldn't completely shut him out. Ethan didn't ask for her attention again. He had come here to survive, not to make her trust him. But when he did speak, it was simply to offer something small, a gesture of kindness. "There's more food in my pack, if you want some," he said quietly, not looking at her but holding out a small ration packet. Laika didn't move. Her instincts screamed at her to refuse, to reject the offer, to stay in the safe distance she had created. But a quiet hunger stirred in her stomach. She hadn't eaten properly in days, and the thought of food, of anything that could make her feel just a little bit better, made her pause. She glanced at him, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. He didn't look at her expectantly, didn't push her to take it. He simply offered it and waited. Laika's hesitation lasted only a moment before she nodded and took the food, her movements stiff and careful. It wasn't a gesture of trust, not entirely. But it was a step, and in that moment, it felt like the only thing she could do. For the rest of the night, the two of them sat in silence, separated by more than just the physical space between them. Laika stayed in her corner, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion, while Ethan stayed by the fire, his presence calm and unthreatening. They didn't speak again that night, but the air between them had shifted. It wasn't a bond, not yet, but it was something that neither of them could ignore. The storm had passed, but the night still felt heavy with tension. Laika sat on the rocky ground of the cave, her eyes fixed on the flickering fire. She had hardly slept. Her mind was too full of questions about the human, about what had happened to her world, and about what she was supposed to do now. She had never been alone before, not like this. The pack was everything to her, and now it was gone. It felt as though part of her soul had been ripped away, leaving a hollow emptiness in its place. Ethan had fallen asleep earlier, his back against the cave wall. His breathing was steady, but Laika couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow different from the others she had encountered. The humans who had destroyed her pack had been merciless, their eyes cold and without remorse. But Ethan was different. He wasn't like them. His kindness had caught her off guard, and every time she thought she might trust him, the memory of her fallen comrades pulled her back into the darkness. She shifted uncomfortably on the cold stone floor. Her muscles ached from the long journey and the battle, but it wasn't just physical pain that gnawed at her. It was the grief, the loss. She missed her pack so much. The pack was where she belonged. They were the ones who had taught her to fight, to hunt, to live as part of something greater than herself. Without them, she felt like a wolf who had lost its pack, lost its purpose. As she stared into the fire, her thoughts drifted to the day the humans had come. She remembered the sound of their ships landing, the explosions that had torn through, the air and the rush of battle that had followed. The Feroian warriors had fought valiantly, but it hadn't been enough. One by one, her pack had fallen, their cries lost in the chaos. Laika had fought until she could fight no more, and in the end, she had fled. The night seemed to stretch on forever, the silence between her and Ethan growing thicker with each passing hour. She wanted to leave, to run far away from everything. But where would she go? The human world was nothing but a place of destruction and death to her. She had no home left, no pack, just endless wilderness, and a war she couldn't escape. Then, suddenly, She heard the soft sound of movement from behind her. Ethan was awake. His eyes were open, watching her quietly. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. His voice was gentle, as if he knew better than to push her, but he couldn't help but ask. Laika didn't answer at first. Her mind was still swirling with thoughts of her fallen pack, of the pain she felt inside. She had never been good at showing weakness, especially not to a human. But his question, so simple, so kind, struck a chord in her. She didn't want to feel weak, but she couldn't ignore the emptiness that had settled inside her. "No," she finally replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not okay." She wasn't sure why she said it, but the words felt right, like a weight had been lifted, even if just for a moment. Ethan nodded, his expression softening. "I can't imagine what you've been through," he said, "but you're not alone anymore." Laika stiffened at his words. She didn't need anyone's pity, and she certainly didn't need a human's sympathy. But the sincerity in his voice made it hard to dismiss him completely. "I've lost everything," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "My pack, my home, everything I've ever known." She swallowed hard, trying to push the lump in her throat away. "I don't know how to move on." Ethan sat up slowly, carefully. He didn't rush toward her, didn't offer empty words of comfort. Instead, he simply watched her with quiet understanding. "I can't bring your pack back," he said softly, "but I can help you. You don't have to be alone anymore." Laika's heart clenched at his words. She had been alone for so long, running from the memories of her fallen comrades, pushing everyone and everything away. But now, for the first time, she felt a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. She quickly pushed the feeling down, unwilling to let it rise up. Hope was dangerous. It had led to disappointment before, and she wouldn't let it do that again. "I don't need anyone," she replied, her voice colder than she intended. "I've survived on my own long enough." Ethan didn't respond to her harsh words. He didn't argue or try to convince her otherwise. He simply sat there, watching her in silence. It wasn't the reaction she had expected. She had wanted him to leave, to let her be alone in her misery. But instead, he stayed. And for some strange reason, it made her feel both uncomfortable and strangely comforted. After a long pause, Ethan spoke again. "You're not a lone wolf, Laika. Even the strongest warriors need help sometimes." She wanted to argue with him, to snap at him and tell him that he didn't understand, that he could never understand. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the weariness in her bones or the overwhelming grief that threatened to swallow her whole. Whatever it was, she didn't say anything. She just sat there, staring into the fire. Ethan watched her for a moment longer before finally standing up. He stretched his arms above his head and then moved to the cave entrance. He glanced back at her. "I'm going to scout the area. We should keep moving tomorrow. The humans could be looking for survivors." Laika didn't reply. She didn't have to. He knew that she would follow, just as she had followed him before. She didn't know what the future held, but in this moment, she realized that she wasn't as alone as she had thought. Ethan was here, and as much as she hated to admit it, he wasn't leaving. As the fire crackled behind her, Laika finally allowed herself to relax, if only for a moment. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel quite as lost. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. The days that followed were filled with silence and uncertainty. Laika and Ethan traveled through the dense forests, moving cautiously, avoiding any sign of human patrols. The landscape seemed foreign to Laika now. The place where she had once hunted with her pack, where the trees had always felt like home, now felt like a trap. Every shadow, every rustle in the leaves made her nervous. She couldn't shake the feeling that danger was always lurking just out of sight. Ethan kept a steady pace beside her, his eyes always scanning their surroundings. He didn't push her to talk, didn't try to fill the silence with words, and for that, she was grateful. Laika wasn't sure how much more of the world she could take, but every moment she spent with him felt like both a blessing and a burden. She didn't want to depend on him, didn't want to rely on a human for anything, but every night when they made camp, and every morning when she woke to find him there beside her, she couldn't deny that something inside her was changing. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something else, something softer. One afternoon, as they moved deeper into the forest, they stumbled upon a hidden ravine. The steep drop was filled with jagged rocks, the bottom covered in dark, swirling water. Laika instinctively stepped back, her claws scraping against the earth as she assessed the situation. She could see a narrow path that led down toward the water, but it was treacherous. The rocks were slippery and the water beneath looked deep and fast-moving. Ethan, however, seemed unbothered. He moved toward the edge of the ravine, inspecting the path below. "We'll have to cross," he said, his voice calm as always. Laika watched him with narrowed eyes. She wasn't sure what bothered her more, the fact that they had to cross the ravine or the way he seemed so confident. She had never been one to take risks. Her pack had always taught her to be careful, to think before acting. But Ethan was different. He wasn't afraid of taking chances. "You're not afraid of this?" she asked, her voice cautious. Ethan glanced back at her, raising an eyebrow. "Afraid?" He shook his head, a slight smile on his face. "I'm more afraid of what's behind us than what's ahead." Laika didn't reply. She wasn't sure if he was being brave or reckless, but she couldn't deny that there was a part of her that admired his determination. For someone who had lost everything, he seemed to have an unshakable confidence. It made her wonder if she could ever find that same strength within herself. Ethan began to climb down the steep path, his movements sure and steady. Laika, watch, eyed him for a moment, before reluctantly following. She had never been one to let fear control her, but as she stepped closer to the edge, the wind picked up, pushing against her fur, making her feel even more vulnerable. The climb was harder than she expected, and every time she glanced down at the swirling water below, her heart skipped a beat. When she reached the halfway point, she slipped. Her claws scraped against the rocky surface, and she felt herself losing her grip. The panic surged in her chest, and for a brief moment, she thought she might fall. But before she could react, she felt a firm hand on her arm. Ethan had reached out to steady her, his grip strong and reassuring. "Don't look down," he said quietly, his voice calm. "Just focus on the next step. You've got this." Laika didn't say anything, but she felt a rush of gratitude. For the first time since the destruction of her pack, she wasn't alone. She wasn't facing this challenge by herself. Ethan's presence was a quiet reassurance, something she hadn't known she needed. Slowly, carefully, she continued climbing, focusing only on the next step, as Ethan had told her. When they finally reached the bottom, both of them were breathless, but unharmed. Laika stood on solid ground, her claws digging into the earth, her body tense from the climb. But the fear that had gripped her before had lessened, replaced by a sense of accomplishment. She had done it. She had crossed the ravine, not alone but with Ethan's help. As they stood there, catching their breath, Ethan turned to her with a small smile. "See? Not so bad." Laika didn't return the smile. Instead, she nodded, her expression serious. "Thank you," she said, her voice low. Ethan didn't reply at first. He just gave her a nod and continued moving forward, as if crossing that ravine was just another part of their journey. But Laika knew better. She could feel the weight of his gesture, the way he had reached out to her when she was about to fall. She didn't understand it, but she was starting to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. trust. They continued their journey, moving through the dense forest, but now, Laika was more aware of the way they worked together. It wasn't just about survival. It was about companionship. Ethan had saved her once, but it was more than that. He had shown her that she wasn't alone. She had spent so long pushing people away, closing herself off from the world. But with Ethan, something was different. He didn't expect her to be strong all the time. He didn't see her as just a warrior or a survivor. He saw her as someone who needed help, someone who needed someone else. That night, as they set up camp, Laika found herself sitting next to him, the fire crackling between them. She didn't feel the need to keep her distance anymore. She didn't feel like she had to pretend she was strong. Ethan's presence had a strange way of making her feel safer, less burdened. It was an unfamiliar feeling, one she hadn't experienced since her pack had been alive. As they sat in silence, Laika finally spoke again. "I still don't trust you completely," she said, her voice low. "But I'm starting to believe you're not like the others." Ethan didn't respond right. Away. He just sat there looking at the fire as if considering her words. Then he turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. "I don't need you to trust me," he said quietly, "but I hope you can." For the first time in a long while, Laika felt a sense of hope stir inside her. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The days continued to pass slowly, each one blending into the next. The forest around them was vast, and the world seemed to grow quieter the farther they traveled. Laika had learned to keep her eyes sharp, constantly scanning for any signs of danger. The humans had left their mark on the land, but there were still many unknowns in the wilderness. Yet in spite of the dangers, there was a strange sense of peace in the quiet moments she shared with Ethan. She found herself growing more comfortable with him. He didn't push her to talk about her past or her pack. He didn't try to pry into her thoughts. He simply moved alongside her, steady and dependable. And in the rare moments when they would sit in the silence of the camp, she didn't feel as alone as she once did. But the world was never truly calm. The storm was always on the horizon. It came on the third night after they crossed the ravine, a heavy, oppressive storm that seemed to descend without warning. The wind began to howl through the trees, pushing against the branches with a force that made the ground tremble beneath them. The clouds grew darker, swirling above them, and the first drops of rain splattered against the earth like bullets. Laika's instincts kicked in immediately. She could feel the change in the air. The storm was coming, and it was going to be bad. The wind howled louder, and the trees began to sway under its strength. The forest, once a place of safety, now felt like an enemy. The storm would not wait for them to find shelter. "We need to find cover," Laika said sharply, her voice low but urgent. She had already begun scanning the surroundings, her keen eyes searching for any place that might provide safety. Ethan, who had been standing quietly by the fire, nodded and immediately began gathering their things. His movements were efficient, but he didn't hurry. His calmness only made Laika more anxious. She wasn't used to being in the open during such. A violent storm and the fear of being caught unprepared gnawed at her. The wind whipped through the trees, and the air grew colder. Laika's fur bristled as the first heavy gusts of wind struck her face. "There's a cave to the west," Ethan said, pointing toward the darkened horizon. His voice was steady, but there was a hint of urgency in it now. "We can make it there, if we move quickly." Laika didn't need any more encouragement. Without a word, she turned and began running in the direction he had pointed. The rain had already started coming down harder, the heavy drops hitting the earth with a deafening thud. The ground beneath their feet was slick with water, and the wind pushed against them with every step. Laika's claws dug into the muddy earth as she tried to maintain her footing. Ethan followed close behind her, his pace steady despite the heavy wind. His eyes remained fixed on her as she led the way, his face calm but alert. Laika found herself grateful for his presence. He wasn't just a human anymore. He was a partner in this struggle for survival. After what felt like hours, they finally reached the cave. The entrance was small, barely large enough for them both to fit through, but it was shelter from the storm. Laika pushed through the opening, followed by Ethan. Once inside, she collapsed against the cold stone walls, breathing heavily. The cave was dark, and the sound of the storm outside was muffled, but the air was thick with the weight of the storm's power. Ethan stood by the entrance, his back against the rock as he watched the storm rage outside. "We should be safe, here," he said quietly, his voice a little strained from the run. Laika nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. The storm had a fierce energy to it, something that made even her feel small and vulnerable. But for the moment, they were safe. The fire they had carried with them was quickly extinguished by the rain, and the temperature in the cave dropped sharply. Laika shivered, wrapping her arms around herself to conserve warmth. The dampness in the air made everything feel heavier. She could hear the storm growing more intense, the wind screaming through the trees outside like a wild beast. "We'll need to wait it out," Ethan said, his voice low. "It's too dangerous to travel in this weather." Laika didn't argue. She knew he was right. The storm wasn't going to pass anytime soon. They would be stuck here for a while, and she couldn't help but feel the weight of that realization. Being in close quarters with Ethan wasn't something she was used to. She had always been alone, always had to rely on herself. But now, here, she was, depending on another person to survive. The thought left her unsettled, and she couldn't quite shake the unease that stirred inside her. She glanced over at Ethan, who was sitting across from her, his eyes closed, his posture relaxed. She envied his calmness. How could he be so at ease when the storm outside was so wild? For a moment, the silence between them stretched. But then, Ethan spoke, his voice soft, almost as if he had been reading her thoughts. "You're not alone, you know," he said, his words gentle but direct. "You don't have to carry this weight by yourself." Laika's chest tightened at his words, and she quickly looked away. She didn't want to hear this right now. She didn't want to acknowledge how true it was. For so long, she had been alone, and I had learned to live with it. She didn't need anyone, not really. She had survived without help. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. The storm had forced her to realize something she had been running from for too long. She couldn't survive alone. Not anymore. Ethan's presence had become a quiet reassurance, and in the heart of the storm, she finally allowed herself to admit it. She had begun to trust him, even if she didn't fully understand why. In the darkness of the cave, with the storm roaring outside, Laika finally allowed herself to lean against the wall, her eyes closing as the exhaustion from the day caught up with her. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. The storm that had raged for hours finally began to ease by morning. The wind was no longer howling, and the heavy rain had slowed to a soft drizzle. Laika woke up in the dim light of the cave, her body stiff from the cold and the long night. The air inside the cave was damp, but it felt safer now that the violent storm had passed. She stretched her muscles, feeling the ache of days spent walking, fighting, and surviving. Ethan was already awake. He sat near the entrance of the cave, his eyes scanning the sky, which was now clear and peaceful, with only a few clouds drifting by. He seemed as steady as ever, unaffected by the chaos of the storm that had only recently subsided. Laika couldn't help but notice how different he was from the humans she had encountered before. While most humans had been soldiers, cold and unfeeling, Ethan seemed like someone who carried both strength and kindness. She couldn't explain why she felt this way. She had been taught to distrust humans, to see them as enemies who would stop at nothing to destroy her kind. And yet, here she was, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was a quiet, uncertain hope, but it was there. It was the first sign of peace she had experienced since the destruction of her pack. Ethan turned to her, his eyes warm. "Looks like the worst is over," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "We should move while the weather's cleared up." Laika nodded, but didn't respond. She stood up slowly, shaking out her fur and stretching. The cold had made her tired, but she was determined to keep going. There was still much to do. They couldn't afford to stay in the cave forever. She had to keep moving, keep surviving, as they packed their belongings. Laika felt the familiar weight of her past pressing down on her. She hadn't had the chance to fully mourn her pack, not yet. Every time she thought about them, the grief was too much to bear. But it was there, lurking, in the back of her mind, ready to surface at any moment. She glanced at Ethan as he folded his gear. He didn't push her. He didn't ask about her past, about the pain she carried with her. He simply moved with quiet purpose, his presence both calming and unsettling. She had never needed anyone like this before. She had always been strong, always had to rely on herself. But now, she realized, she didn't have to do everything alone. As they began walking out of the cave, Laika felt a shift in the air. The sky was bright, and the sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. It was a new day, and for the first time it felt like a new beginning. The forest, which had once felt so foreign and threatening, now seemed more like a place of possibility. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about finding a way forward, about building something from the wreckage of her past. The two of them walked in silence for a while, the only sounds being the soft rustling of the trees and the distant call of birds. Laika's mind wandered back to her pack. She could still remember their voices, the way they laughed together, the sense of unity they shared. That was what she had lost. But now, she was starting to realize that perhaps the future didn't have to be defined by what was lost. Maybe, just maybe, it could be shaped by what they could still build together. Ethan broke the silence, his voice low. "I know it's not the same, but I want you to know that I'll help you, Laika. Whatever you need, I'll be here." Laika glanced at him, surprised by the sincerity in his words. She had never expected anyone to offer help so freely. And yet, here he was, a human, someone she had every reason to distrust, offering her something precious, his support. "I don't know what comes next," Laika said, her voice quiet but firm. "But I don't think I can do it alone anymore." Ethan smiled, a small, knowing smile. "You don't have to." They walked together through the forest, heading toward a place Laika hadn't seen in years. It was a part of the land she had once called home, a secluded spot her pack had used for shelter. She hadn't been back since the attack, but now she felt an odd sense of determination to see it again. Maybe it would help her find some closure, some way to heal. As they approached the edge of the familiar clearing, Laika paused. The place had changed. The trees were still standing, the ground still covered in moss and ferns, but everything felt different. The air felt heavier, as if the land itself was mourning the loss of the pack that had once lived there. Laika's heart ached. This was where they had all been, where they had fought together and shared their lives. She could almost hear their voices in the wind, feel their presence in the space around her. But they were gone. The clearing was empty. Silent. Ethan stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. He didn't say anything, but his presence was comforting. It wasn't about words. It was about the simple fact that he was there, standing with her as she faced the past. "I'm not sure what to do with this place," Laika murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to let go." Ethan gave her a soft, understanding look. You don't have to let go all at once. Just take it one step at a time. Laika nodded, her gaze fixed on the clearing. There was still so much pain, but for the first time she didn't feel like she had to carry it alone. The future was uncertain, but she was starting to believe that there might be a way forward, and that, for now, was enough. The two of them stood there for a while longer, the wind gently swaying the trees, as if nature itself was offering its quiet support. Then, when Laika was ready, they turned away from the clearing and continued their journey. It wasn't the end of the road, but it was the beginning of something new.